Boom. 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 I'm someone who oftentimes gets hired by small businesses to come in and fix their business through marketing, sales, operations, and recruiting. At which that point, I'm wearing multiple hats and doing multiple jobs. The first time I ever did this, I ended up doing a lot of work day to day, running around like I had my head cut off, only to complete 35% of anything that I did that day. You hear the idiom, you're in over your head. And that is exactly what was wrong with how I was approaching these businesses and going about fixing these businesses. So I found that focusing on the foundational aspects of a business and building the foundation to be able to support everything else that goes along with scaling the business up and growing that business, I started to find that I was able to get a lot more done and hiring the right people in the right roles to continue scaling the business up and supporting the foundation of the business. At that point, I started seeing a lot more successful businesses under my tutelage. Now, what does that all mean in regards to Ashes of Creation? When I look at Ashes of Creation, I see an over-ambitious mess. I see a game that isn't willing to commit to any one playstyle, any one gameplay trope, any one thing. Instead, it's trying to do everything to make everyone happy. And that's going down to its fundamental gameplay, tab targeting and action combat. That's going to be a balancing nightmare. PvE, dungeons, instance content with a heavy emphasis on PvP. Nodes that transform over time. The more you do things in those particular areas and then reset after a certain amount of time. Cool. Phasing technology. It's not anything we haven't seen before. Bottom line is that it's a theme park MMO, but it wants to add sandbox elements to the game. And it's not fully committing to anything. Instead, what I see is a game that has a lot of, wouldn't it be cool if we could do this? Wouldn't it be cool to chop down a tree and watch it grow back? Wouldn't it be cool if we added a lot more particle effects in the action combat? And yes, those things are cool. They are very cool. But how much development is going towards adding these things into the game without first having anything substantial as far as what the game does? What is Ashes doing differently than other MMOs? Nipples. As it stands, the game doesn't have a base foundation, yet it already has feature creep. It's already adding more and more features, and it's starting to look more and more like Star Citizen, where they're missing every deadline. They announced the game back in 2015, and it's still not set to release 8 years later. And then there's all this talk about innovation in a stagnant genre like an MMO. And I'm not seeing anything innovative here other than it's adding everything into one game. When I think about innovation and I look at other games, primarily single player games throughout the years and how they've grown and adjusted and have learned from each other to make better and better games over time, I look at a studio like Larian Studios, who created the Divinity series and is now working on Baldur's Gate 3. And the innovation that they have done to the CRPG as a whole. What Larian Studios did was take the CRPG formula and try to make it as close to a tabletop game as they could. Its combat systems were not revolutionary. It's just simple turn-based combat that we've seen since pen and paper Dungeons and Dragons, where everything is based off of initiative rolls, and then you're rolling your dice, and then you have action points, and then you can do this on this turn, on this round. There's nothing new about this. But what they did do is add a ton of systems to give so many different options. Even spell effects like dropping a fireball on the ground and then seeing the ground catch on fire and then casting rain to remove the fire, to wet down the ground, causing steam clouds. They gave a rain spell use, a non-damaging spell that only affects the environment, had a purpose. And these systems continued on throughout the game, not just through combat, but through even quest text, where it says something as simple as get off the island, but doesn't give you any direction on how to do it. So you find all these different ways to actually jump off this island or get off of this island, and it's fantastic. It's fantastic how many systems are implemented and the thousands of different options that you have for every encounter, between dialogue to combat to how you traverse the land to just ingenious ways to complete the game. And that's what true innovation looks like. And no one has done that in the MMO genre since World of Warcraft, and they didn't really do it either. I would argue since Star Wars Galaxies, innovation has been pretty much dead. That being said, I don't think Ashes of Creation is innovating. And I want to take you through a couple of the reasons why, as far as feature creep and what's going on with the game. So I wanted to show you the initial release date and milestones for Ashes of Creation, and this is a snapshot back in 2018. By now, the game should have released. It was launched for live before 2020. This is back when they had an idea and a main focus as far as the game as a whole. And they weren't adding a bunch of things in. They were just, hey, this is what we're doing. An Alpha 1 release, 2018. Alpha 2, Persistent Alpha, which is what a lot of founders bought the game for, 2018. And then the betas we're looking at the beginning of 2019. Okay, so this is their initial window. But then I would argue the reason that it's now this, and we haven't even hit, it's now 2023, and we haven't even hit anything that it promised years ago. And the only other game that I could think of that really did this is, there's two games. There's Duke Nukem Forever, which we all know how that fucking turned out. And then there's Star Citizen, which is still every day, coming up with new ways to try and get more money out of its whales. But I would argue the reason for this, and this is something that happens with a lot of games. A lot of games actually do a lot of pushbacks. Like, they don't realize how much it actually takes to develop a game or what goes into developing a game. So they end up pushing it back. But here we go. In 2018, when we were supposed to get this alpha, we ended up getting a battle royale. And the battle royale was poorly optimized, and it was pretty fucking terrible. It was a cool concept, just pretty fucking terrible. But what happened here is that the fellas over and ladies, the fellas and ladies over at Intrepid just keep adding new shit. They just keep going. They're like, hey, you know what would be really cool is if we had some tree chopping going on.
All right, let's just
over here, because we played a little bit of New World and we really liked how trees fell down and then made sounds, except we're going to go a step further and add trees growing back. Cool. Okay. Why? Why are we, how much development time went into making a tree fade out of existence and then grow back? And all this tree is doing is just transforming. All they're doing is enlarging it through the program. It's not really doing anything. And this was an entire update that was months in between another update. They have no solid focus on what they need to get done as far as a solid game. Then we look at things like combat and tanking and the combat systems. And when we're looking at combat systems, it's kind of a mixture of everything. You can't see damage numbers. So is it really an RPG? Because the damage isn't really noticeable. The combat doesn't feel weighty when you're using a hammer. The animations are a little janky, but I mean, aside from the aesthetics of it all, they're not really pushing the envelope on what a tank does or what a healer does or what DPS do, or adding any systems outside of, hey, this mob targeted you and now it's running at you and now you have to play the aggro game, or just adding systems in place to change the formula just a little bit, to add a little bit innovation. It's kind of a letdown. But the hybrid combat then becomes somewhat of an issue as well, because you now have soft targeting, tab targeting, action combat. Do you know how incredibly difficult it will be to balance this? Because there are some people who are going to be godlike at action combat. I think of any pro Valorant player who can actually aim, or a pro CSGO player who can actually aim. They're going to be godlike. They're not going to miss that often, and they're going to do ridiculous amounts of damage. The other issue is having that tab targeting guarantee that you're going to hit someone, pending hit percentages. But when you have when you have variants like that, the more variables that you add, to the base gameplay or the base combat system, it becomes more and more difficult to balance. It becomes more things to look out for, because you do have those people who are going to be very good at aiming versus the people who aren't very good at aiming. And now, hey, because I suck at this one thing, I'm losing out on this particular aspect of the game. Or when it's just, you can't do both. Now you think you could do both, can't do both. There's a saying in the world, in history, there's this famous saying by Michael Scott: keep it simple, stupid. You start to overcomplicate things, you're not innovating anything, you're just making a clusterfuck of a game. You're making a clusterfuck of gameplay tools. Look at Elden Ring or any of the Souls-likes. They don't do anything crazy with their gameplay. You have a heavy swing, a light swing, and you can two-hand a single-handed weapon. And then you have a dodge roll and a block. It's literally the easiest gameplay, the simplest form of gameplay, yet the most engaging gameplay available. Not necessarily available, but the most engaging gameplay out there. So this is all the reasons why I think people need to stop looking at the graphics and saying, wow, this is a super pretty game, because it is a very pretty game, and start being a little bit more objective towards the game, because that kind of criticism will help push the game in the right direction. Don't buy into the hype. We've seen this time and time again. The next WoW killer, the next this, the next that. And then every game just ends up being World of Warcraft. And I get that that's the blueprint and that's what everybody is looking for, or at least is what everyone's expecting out of an MMO. The problem is that we get overexcited, and then that puts a lot of pressure on the developers to keep adding all these extra things that doesn't need to be in the game. Take a step back, reel in some of your hype, and keep watch on the game. That's all I have. See ya.